Coming to you from our new crib up here in Cleveland, Tennessee. You know, we've been up here now permanently for about a week. We're just trying to get stuff done. We're trying to make the house the way we want it. You know, getting a lot of yard work done, landscaping, different stuff like that, the inside. Shoot, yeah. All my fishing equipment is still in totes. I don't even have the boat in the boat garage yet. It's sitting out in the driveway. So that's going to be the next thing on my agenda, is try to get organized, get all my stuff out, get it all unboxed. I can't wait to be able to get out and get on Chickamauga and do some serious fishing. But we're enjoying it so far. In the last month, man, we have made 4 round trips back and forth, Florida to Tennessee, Tennessee to Florida. You know, I made that trip up I-75 all the way Tennessee, Alabama. You follow towing a boat. I've never done it driving a 26-foot U-Haul. Done it twice, guys. That was the hardest. You know, I'm no truck driver, but I will tell you that was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. You know, I got a new added respect for all truck drivers around the world. Hats off to you guys. That is the hardest thing I have ever had to do, is drive that 26-foot U-Haul from Florida all the way up here twice. It's mentally draining. I consider myself a fairly good driver. Like I say, I've towed the boat all over the place. No comparison, guys. It was tough. But anyway, we made it. We're up here. We made it safe. Can't wait to get on the lake. And start pounding away on Lake Chickamauga. But I tell you what, kind of a little bit bittersweet this move was. You know, both me and the wife decided, we've been contemplating for the last few years to do this. Now we got our both daughters up here, grandson up here, so we got our family up here now. You know, we want to have a little bit nicer with where everybody can be together, the holidays. So, you know, we decided to go ahead and do it, make the move up here. But again, a little bit bittersweet for me. You know, I've lived in Lake Placid all my life. That's you know, I grew up in Lake Placid, went to the school in Lake Placid. You know, worked in Lake Placid for the last 10 years. I've been guiding. Freshwater guide on the Lake Placid. You know, it's Lake Charles that everybody knows as Lake Placid. You know, met a lot of great people, gained a lot of great friendships through guide and chartering on the lake. So a lot of great memories. But it's time to start and get some fresh memories up here on Lake Chickamauga. So anyway, a little bit bittersweet, but I want to talk to everybody and a little bit about Lake Placid, the Lake Placid, that is. I started fishing Lake Placid back in the early 90s. Back then, you know, we didn't have the electronics back then that we have today, or we didn't have the tungsten weights back then that we have today. So things were a little bit different back then, and back when I started fishing offshore on Placid, there was only a handful of people that was actually doing it, that actually knew to do it. You know, you'd have people ask you all the time, you caught a fish out of how deep in South Florida? 25 foot of water? They think you're nuts. Because back then nobody knew you'd come down here to South Florida and fish 25 foot of water in structure and catch fish like you could do out of state. So anyway, you know, I started fishing back in the early 90s. Again, I'd count on my one hand how many people actually was fishing offshore in Placid, or knew that they actually could fish offshore in Placid back then. Shortly after, I joined a bass club. Now the bass club, we fish Lake Placid 4 times a year. So, you know, my wheels are constantly turning, always trying to think of new ways to be able to do stuff different, thinking outside the box. And again, remember, we didn't have the electronics that we have today back then. The electronics we had back then would not tell you exactly it, you know, or you cannot read that you were actually fishing a shell bed. It would show you stuff coming up off the bottom, like tree pollen, stuff like that, but you couldn't differentiate what, if you're fishing a shell bed, if you're fishing chunk rock, you couldn't really tell by your electronics, other than seeing something coming up, sticking up off the bottom, what it was. So, my wheels are always spinning, always turning, trying to think of different ways to do things. Once I joined the Bass Club, I'm trying to figure out different ways that I could try to get an edge on everybody else, all my competition. So I started, that's kind of where the heavy weight came into play back then. You'll never catch me, even to today, with the flat-out tungsten weights today. You'll never catch me throwing under a 3/4 ounce weight. 3/4 ounce weight's the minimum you'll catch me throwing, even if it's common, because that heavier weight gives you a better feel on the bottom of what you're fishing. As you do it long enough and get better at it, you'll actually be able to tell just by the feel of that weight what it's knocking into, what it's banging, how it's digging in, what you're fishing. If you're fishing over a shell bed and that weight's digging in a certain way, you'll be able to tell just by the feel of your weight that you're fishing a shell bed. Same as hard bottom, sandy bottom, shrimp grass, you'll be able to tell just by the feel of how that weight feels what you're fishing. So without the electronics back then, that kind of gave me an idea of what I was fishing. Here's a little secret. I'll tell everybody a little secret. And by no means am I telling you don't learn how to read your electronics. You have to know your electronics. You have to learn you have to know what you're looking at on your electronics. But there's a lot of people out there that's their main drawback is they have trouble being able to read the electronics properly. You still got to learn how to read them. Know what you're looking at. But for the time being, until you really key yourself in on learning how to do that properly, for you people, for you anglers that struggle with that, there's thousands and thousands of shell beds on Placid. Some of them's large, some of them small, but there's thousands of them out there. Go out and keep your boat in between 13 foot of water and 29 foot of water. Get yourself a 3/4 ounce flat out tungsten, a weight no lighter, at minimum 3/4 ounce. Drop it over the side and just randomly start dragging it around. And wait for how that weight's feeling. You always want to have a mental snapshot of what's going on at the time. When you get bit, you want to remember what the scenario was when you get bit, or how that weight was feeling, so you can duplicate it next time. When you get bit, mark it as a waypoint. There's a reason you got bit. There's a reason that fish was there. You're randomly fishing over something that was holding that fish there. Mark it as a waypoint. And you can do that and find all kinds of shell beds just by the feel of your weight dragging it around. Again, stay between 13 foot and 29 foot. Drag that weight around. Feel what you're fishing. When you get bit, mark it as a waypoint. You're marking a shell bed, or you're marking something that's keeping that fish there. Okay, so we didn't have electronics. That's kind of how I got keyed in on what we were fishing out there back in the day. And back in the day, I was using a 3/4 ounce lead egg sinker, followed by a glass bead. So we didn't have the tungsten. The tungsten, you get so much of a better feel to that. You get that sharpness to it. You get that sharp feel. It's so much easier to feel what you're fishing with tungsten. So, started doing that, started kind of finding different shell beds, stuff like that out there. Then I started playing around with the baits, small baits, large baits, intermediate baits. You can catch fish all different ways out there. You don't have to throw a Carolina rig to catch fish offshore. You throw crankbaits, drug shot. There's a lot of different ways to catch fish. But again, my favorite always has been the Carolina rig. That's what I kind of stuck with. I wanted to perfect how to fish the Carolina rig. So I didn't only catch big fish, I caught big stringers on the same day, and I wanted to be able to consistently do that. So I wanted to take one rig and perfect it instead of going from rig to rig. I wanted to perfect one way to fish and get perfect at it. So anyway, I started playing around with the baits, and I found out that the bass prefer big baits versus small baits. Whether you're catching a 1.5 pound bass or whether you're catching a 10-pound bass, that 1.5 pound bass would rather eat a 12-inch worm than a 6 or 8-inch worm. So the bass like big baits out there. No matter what size the bass is, they want those big baits. Okay, once I found that out, now I start playing around with my rig, the leader in general. Getting back to the baits real quick, I do have to throw this in. About 4 years ago, Mike Lingle and Bruiser Bait teamed up and came out with the Big Nasty. I tell you what, when I first seen the Big Nasty, my eyes lit up. Because I've been throwing 12-inch ribbon tail worms out there since the early mid-90s. But when I see that bait, I'm like, that is the bait. That's going to be the ticket for consistently catching monsters on Placid. That bait, that one bait. Well, I was able to get my hands on a couple packages of them. The first time out, I caught one close to 8 pounds, over 7 pounds the first 5 minutes I was out with the bait. So right then, I'm like, that is going to be the ticket for consistently catching not only big fish, but big streamers of fish consistently, the Big Nasty. And kind of ironically now, everybody that you see fishing offshore, throwing a Carolina rig, everybody's going to have at least 1 or 2 rods rigged with the Big Nasty on it today. So that's kind of pretty cool. But anyway, okay, getting back to now, I start playing around with the leader. Different sizes. Your typical leader length on a Carolina rig is people run anywhere from 12-inch to 18-inch leader. No matter where you go, you're always going to see them 12-inch, 18, 20-inch leader line. I started playing around with leader, and what I found is bass like the bait. The further you could put the bait from the weight on a Carolina rig, the better the bass like it. If you could run your baits 15 foot behind the weight, the bass will like it better. But of course you can't run them 15 foot behind the weight. There's no way you can physically possibly do that. So that's where the 7-foot leader came in. And the reason I came up with a 7-foot leader is you could still controllably fish a Carolina rig using a 7-foot leader. The biggest question people ask me is, how in the heck do you cast it? Well, it's really easy. Once you get good at casting a Carolina rig with a 7-foot leader, you can cast it every bit as far as any lure you have in your tackle box, and with as much accuracy. And the whole trick to casting a Carolina rig with a 7-foot leader is you don't want it to buckle behind you on your backswing. Don't whip it over your shoulder and cast it. You want to sweep it. As long as that leader line stays extended throughout the whole cast process, you will never have any issues, and you'll be able to whip that Carolina rig every bit as far as any lure in your box, and with as much accuracy as well. So, and again, ironically, today, if we look at 95% of the boats fishing offshore that are in a Carolina rig, look at the leader. Every one of them, mark my words, is throwing a 7-foot leader today, which is, again, that's pretty cool. Knowing that, that was kind of my thing back in the day, and kind of got the 7-foot leader started rolling. Everybody is throwing a 7-foot leader today, which is... Okay guys, I want to show you my rig and how I tie the Carolina rig. Alright, I use a 7-9 Reaper rod flipping stick. That is the rod I use for throwing my Carolina rig. It is a 7-9 flipping stick by Reaper rods. Alright. First of all, I use 20-pound monofilament coming off my reel. Alright. 20-pound monofilament coming off the reel. Now, I will use about a 3-pound test lighter leader than the line coming off the reel. And the reason being is, if you ever get hooked on the bottom where you can't get it out, okay? you're more apt to breaking off your leader line, your hook, versus losing your whole rig. Tungsten weights, they're not cheap, and it could put a dent in your pocketbook if you start losing a lot of weights in your whole rig versus just your hook. So I like to use a little bit lighter leader line than my main line, but anyway, coming off your line, coming off your rod tip, you're going to have your flat out tungsten weight. Again, 3/4 ounce minimum is what I use. Don't use anything under, because I want that feel that that heavier weight's going to have on the bottom of what you're fishing. Stay more in tune with what you're fishing, using 3/4 ounce minimum. Even when it's not blowing, even when it's pretty calm out, still use that 3/4 ounce. As the wind blows stronger, it picks up. If you're out in 25-mile-an-hour winds, you go up to 1 ounce, ounce and a quarter. You want a heavy enough weight to keep on the bottom, but don't go anywhere below 3/4 ounce. Okay, now here's where things get a little bit different. Typical Carolina rig, you want to run your weight, you want to run a bead. Normally you hear everybody talk about glass bead. Well, glass bead back in the day was what you used. Today, with tungsten weights of today, you cannot use a glass bead. Tungsten material, tungsten weight will crack a glass bead if you use a glass bead. So, Bass Addiction gear, flat out tungsten. And I don't think this weight, when they came out with it, was ever intended to be used in this aspect, but they came out with what they call a C-rig weight. It's a barrel weight, but it's considered a C-rig weight. I think when it first came out, they intended it to be used as a lightweight Carolina rig weight, but it works perfect, guys, as your bead behind your. Now what you got is you got tungsten banging into tungsten. And that's one of the ways a Carolina rig works is, Carolina rig works a couple different ways to attract the fish to the bait. You're going to have the noise it's going to make when it hits something, knocks into something, it's clanking back and forth. That's one of the attractive factors that attracts that fish to the bait coming behind it. The other thing is the disturbance, the cloud it's making, the disturbance it's making on the bottom as it's going along. But you want that noise. Now you got tungsten clanking against tungsten. You get a lot better sound, guys. Do you hear that? Do you hear the noise that makes? Just the bead clanking against the tungsten clanking against tungsten. A pinging sound. Even back in the day before they came out with tungsten weights, lead on a glass bead, you wouldn't have near that attracting sound that you have of today's tungsten. You'd have a clunking sound almost versus the ping that you're going to get with the tungsten. Okay, after that, guys, your swivel. So you got your flat out tungsten weight followed by your barrel weight or your flat out C-rig weight acting as your bead. Then you got your swivel. Then after your swivel, guys, your 7-foot leader. You got your leader tied on. I always use a fluorocarbon leader. Alright, you got your 7-foot leader. We're still going. Alright, that's your 7-foot leader. And I use a 5/0 offset shank, wide gap hook. And of course, this particular bait I have tied on this one is the bling. This is the color called the bling. Big Nasty is one of your better colors on Placid as well, is the bling. But people ask me all the time, using such a long bait, why don't you have to use a larger hook for the larger bait? Well, you don't need to, guys. Use a larger bait, or use a larger hook. It's going to add weight to that bait. It's going to cut down a lot of the action that that bait's going to have. The smaller, lighter hook you could use, the better action the bait's going to have. You're not going to cut that action out of the bait. Now, with a longer worm like this, I do actually run a hook a little bit further down in the head of the worm. You see, I almost run it about 1 3/4 inches down, just because it is a longer bait. But 95% of the time, if a bass hits a worm on the bottom, whether it's a 1.5-pound bass or a 10-pound bass, they're usually going to grab from the head of the bait. First thing that goes in their mouth is the hook. One suck, even if it's a 1.5-pound fish with this worm, one suck, the whole bait's going to be in that fish's mouth, including the hook. So 5/0's all you need, no matter what length worm you're throwing. But that's the rig right there. Big Nasty, guys. that worm is the ticket out there. Bass like big baits, big bass, but the thing about the longer, the bigger baits out there, it's not going to eliminate your numbers. You're still going to catch your numbers, but you're going to catch your big fish as well. So you're not eliminating numbers, because the smaller fish is still going to eat the bigger baits out there. So that's the rig, guys. Other than that, guys, I'm going to wrap this thing up. Guys, tight lines. Be safe. You know, the stuff we talked about, if you're out on Placid, try them. I hope that, you know, if you try the different techniques, different things we talked about today, it will help you possibly put one more fish in the boat or some more big fish in the boat, guys. These techniques work. A lot of research, time spent on these different ways that I do things today out on Placid. Give them a try, guys. I hope it helps you. Again, if you're ever up in the Tennessee or the Lake Chickamauga area, give me a call, guys. My contact information is going to appear on the screen at the end of the video. Book a trip, man. Let's start making some new memories up here in Tennessee. Guys, tight lines. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on Facebook as well as YouTube. And send me comments, guys. I like to hear your feedback. I like to hear your comments. Guys, tight lines. Be safe. And I will see all of you on the water.